Hi, and welcome to our first lecture on David Hume. I'm going to break this into two small online lectures so as not to tax anybody's attention span needlessly. So we are in the 18th century. Hume died in 1776, a reasonably easy date for Americans to remember, though you are not held responsible for knowing the date of his death. Any econ majors out there might want to know that his literary executor and one of his best friends was Adam Smith. Edinburgh, Scotland, where Hume lived, was one of the great centers of learning during the 18th century. By this time, Newton had triumphed not just in Britain, but also on the continent. Pierre-Simon Laplace had made Newton safe for French and German speakers, and the English had been converts to Newtonianism from 100 years earlier. Hume is one of the great philosophers who ever lived. He's one of the best writers among philosophers who ever lived. And he is thinking through what it means to be a Newtonian. In many ways, he's a great defender of Newton. You can also read him as showing just what you are signing on to if you sign on to a thoroughgoing Newtonianism. Hume, even more than Newton, highlights Newton's empiricism. Empiricism is a family of views clustered around the idea of experience. So let's start with empiricism about evidence. All of our scientific evidence comes from experience. So Newton is trying to discipline science in terms of experience. This is closely connected to his suspicion of hypotheses. We don't get any direct experience about what causes gravity to happen, where it comes from. And so Newton, because he's an inductivist, he notes patterns in experience and generalizes them. So he says it's as if there's a gravitational force. Maybe there is a gravitational force. We don't have any direct experience about what brings it about, so we just say it operates everywhere. What it is, we are silent about. And so Hume is trying to carry that approach forward to its, as it were, logical conclusion. If you confine yourself to experience and inductive generalizations from experience, if you think science is about noticing important patterns, what is crucial about Newton is not just that they were patterns, they were quantitatively measurable and testable patterns. So if you think science is about noticing patterns, refraining from forming hypotheses about what brings them about, and pushing those patterns as far as you can in experience rather than behind experience, then you're basically within the Newtonian framework, and Hume is following out the philosophical consequences of that framework. For those of you who are philosophy majors, and there are a few of you in the class, you've probably read Hume before, but he looks a little different read against the background of the history and philosophy of science than he does on his own. For those of you who are not philosophy majors, we often present Hume as an empiricist skeptic, as tracing out consequences due to Locke and Berkeley. Don't worry about those folks if you're not familiar with them. What I'm saying here is compatible with that, but I'm presenting Hume as the foremost philosophical follower of Newton. Let me give you a little textual evidence for this. The very first sentence of our excerpt, it's on page 226 of your historical anthology. Hume says, "There are no ideas which occur in metaphysics more obscure and uncertain than those of power, force, energy, or necessary connection, of which it is every moment necessary for us to treat in all our disquisitions." In a standard philosophy class, we tend to focus on the idea of necessary connection, which is part and parcel of the idea of causation, as we're going to see. But I want you to note, especially if you're a science type, force is a crucial Newtonian notion, and that's a crucial part of what Hume is examining here. His argument is mainly semantic. Semantics is the theory of meaning. It is contrasted with syntax. You're not going to be tested on this, I'm just trying to teach you some stuff, which is the theory of grammaticality. The first sentence of Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll goes, "'Twas brillig and the slithy tove did gyre and gimble in the wabe." That is a sentence, but it's not a meaningful sentence. We can tell that it's grammatical, but we don't know what it means. So there's syntax, which is whether you've got a sentence. Semantics is about what the sentence means. And there's pragmatics, which is the theory of utterances, really. Why is it okay to say there's a beer in the fridge if you want one, when we all know perfectly well that whether there's a beer in the fridge doesn't depend on whether you want one or not. So sometimes we can say things that are semantically problematic. To say there's a beer in the fridge if you want one looks like the words strongly suggest that whether there's a beer in the fridge depends on whether you want one. Pragmatics is about why it's okay to say things like that, even though they don't have the semantic meaning that we would think they do. So we are here in the theory of semantics. Hume is interested in what causal talk means, how we understand it, what it amounts to. And because he's a very strong empiricist, he insists that all of our concepts have to be traced back to experience. We know, for instance, that there are parts of the spectrum, or parts of light, as it were, not parts of the observable spectrum, that other creatures can encounter. They presumably look like colors to those creatures. We don't have any meaningful idea of what those colors look like because we can't experience them. So for Hume, we can recombine concepts, we can have an idea of something like a unicorn that we've never experienced, but we are taking things that we've experienced, like a horse and a horn and the property of whiteness. And so we can generate ideas of things that we have not experienced, but every legitimate concept ultimately must be traced back to some combination of ideas that we encounter in experience. So what do we experience that gives us an idea of causation? This is the heart of Hume's argument. So Hume points out that all experience gives us is conjunctions of events. Another way of putting this is all experience gives you is one damn thing after another. We do not experience connections between events. Hume famously gives the example of billiard balls. If you're shooting pool, you will hear a sound. You will see the cue ball move from point A to point B. You will hear another sound, and you will hear the 8-ball move from point B to point C. And you can do things like that and see it over and over and over. But we don't see the cue ball making the 8-ball move. All we see is a conjunction of those events. The cue ball touches the 8-ball, and then the 8-ball moves. We think the cue ball moves the 8-ball, by which we mean causes it to move, makes it move. But we don't experience the causing, we don't experience the making. Crucially, Hume thinks this is true internally as well. We don't have any idea of internal causation, of my making my arm move by my deciding to do it. In part because how that happens is very opaque to us. There's a lot of intermediary steps, and all I experience, even internally, is irregularity. When I decide to move my arm, it moves. Why I can't move my liver that way is just a mystery. It's a pattern in experience. Again, Hume is a Newtonian, and so what he wants to do is trace ideas to experience and generalize therefrom. And what we don't have any experiential access to, we can't meaningfully talk about. So far, you might think Hume is saying causal talk doesn't mean anything. We have no idea of what makes something happen. Again, experience just tells us one damn thing after another. So if we don't have an idea of causation out in the world, in the billiard ball case, and we don't have an idea of causation of making happen internally, when I decide to move my arm, then maybe we don't have any idea of causation at all. Well, Hume is more resourceful than that. The idea of a genuine connection among events is redirected, it's diverted to our thoughts about the events rather than the events themselves. So my idea of a necessary connection is that I am forced to think of the 8-ball moving when I think of it as being contacted by the cue ball. This is an anticipation of the famous psychology experiment about Pavlov's dogs. Repetition, constant conjunction, brings in us habits of expectation. And the connection between the first event of the cue ball moving and the second event of the 8-ball moving is in our minds. It's a connection of habit. Hume calls it the imagination. Getting clear about that is above our pay grade in this course. But the point is, the idea of necessary connection is in our minds, not out in the world. So we can meaningfully talk about necessary connections among events, but when we try to certify that idea by tracing it back to experience, we find that it's just a habit of thinking in us rather than an experienced connection between events out in the world. I will wrap up this first lecture now, and then the second half of this lecture will look at Hume's positive account of causation. What can causation believably be given these constraints on the meaning of causal talk? The constraints are any meaningful statement has to ultimately be traced back to sources and experience, and we've seen we don't experience connections among events, only conjunctions. Thanks as always for your time.